The camera opens not on a battlefield, but on silence. A long corridor inside the Kremlin, heavy doors, dim lighting, history pressing in from every wall. Wars are often explained through explosions, troop movements, and front lines marked in red. But the most decisive moments of this conflict are not unfolding in trenches or ruined cities. They are unfolding behind closed doors, in meetings that never make headlines, in calculations never spoken aloud, in a power structure that measures victory not in miles gained, but in leverage preserved. Tonight, we step inside that calculation. Because the question shaping the next phase of this war is no longer what is happening in Ukraine. It is what Vladimir Putin is preparing to do next. According to multiple verified international news outlets, including Reuters and the Associated Press, recent weeks have marked a sharp shift in tone from Moscow. The Kremlin has publicly dismissed Western-backed diplomatic frameworks, rejected ceasefire language, and doubled down on rhetoric framing the war not as a regional conflict, but as a generational struggle against NATO itself. This is not accidental. It is strategic. For nearly 3 years, the war has moved through distinct phases: shock invasion, Ukrainian resistance, Russian retrenchment, Western military aid, counteroffensives, stalemates, and escalations. Each phase was accompanied by carefully crafted messaging from Moscow. Each adjustment reflected not weakness, but recalibration. And now, the recalibration is happening again. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has warned that the war is entering what he describes as a long confrontation phase, one where Russia no longer seeks rapid breakthroughs, but sustained pressure. In a recent address, Zelensky made clear that Moscow's rejection of NATO-backed peace proposals is not diplomatic posturing. It is a signal that Russia believes time is now working in its favor. From the Kremlin's perspective, the battlefield is only one dimension. The real contest stretches across political calendars in Washington, elections across Europe, defense production timelines, public fatigue, and alliance cohesion. According to analysts cited by major European security think tanks, Moscow's strategy increasingly revolves around endurance, not dominance. This is the Kremlin's calculus. Putin understands something fundamental. Wars are rarely decided by who strikes hardest, but by who lasts longer. And recent signals from Moscow suggest a belief that Western unity, not Ukrainian resolve, is the most fragile variable in this equation. This belief shapes everything. It shapes why Russia has intensified missile and drone strikes on energy infrastructure rather than urban centers alone. According to verified reporting, these strikes are designed less to capture territory and more to exhaust systems, power grids, logistics chains, air defenses. The objective is not collapse overnight, but cumulative strain. It also shapes why Russia has escalated rhetoric around NATO involvement. By framing the war as a defensive stand against Western encroachment, the Kremlin reinforces domestic legitimacy while simultaneously raising the stakes for alliance decision-makers. But this strategy carries risks, because while Moscow may see patience as its advantage, Ukraine sees time as a weapon too. And Western military integration has reached levels unthinkable at the war's outset. Training pipelines, intelligence sharing, long-range strike capabilities, and air defense coordination now operate with unprecedented speed. According to a verified international defense report, Ukraine's ability to target Russian logistical hubs has improved dramatically over the past year. These are not symbolic strikes. They are designed to disrupt supply chains, erode morale, and force Moscow into costly defensive adaptations. And this is where Putin's next move becomes critical. Does the Kremlin escalate horizontally, expanding pressure into maritime zones, cyber domains, or energy transit corridors? Or does it escalate vertically, increasing strike intensity, loosening targeting constraints, and testing Western red lines more aggressively? Recent developments suggest Moscow is probing both. International maritime monitoring organizations have reported heightened Russian naval activity across contested waters. Cybersecurity agencies across Europe have warned of increased intrusion attempts linked to state-backed actors. And Russian officials have repeatedly emphasized that new tools remain unused, a phrase deliberately vague, deliberately unsettling. This ambiguity is not weakness. It is leverage. Putin has always understood that uncertainty itself is a weapon. By refusing to define clear limits, the Kremlin forces adversaries to plan for worst-case scenarios, draining political capital and military resources before a single move is made. Yet this strategy is unfolding against a backdrop of growing internal pressures. According to independent economic assessments cited by global financial outlets, Russia's war economy is functioning, but at increasing cost. Labor shortages, inflationary pressures, and defense spending priorities are reshaping domestic life. The Kremlin must now balance sustained military engagement with internal stability. This tension explains the dual messaging we see from Moscow: confidence abroad, control at home. State media emphasizes resilience, inevitability, and historical destiny. Dissent is suppressed not because it threatens collapse, but because it threatens narrative coherence. The war must remain framed as necessary, unavoidable, and winnable, even as timelines stretch and sacrifices mount. And this brings us back to the heart of the calculation. Putin is not seeking a dramatic final act. He is seeking a durable position, one where Russia emerges not necessarily victorious, but unbroken, unisolated, and strategically indispensable. That is why peace proposals framed around immediate ceasefires are dismissed. They freeze lines without resolving leverage. They lock Russia into costs without delivering concessions. From the Kremlin's perspective, they interrupt momentum rather than conclude conflict. But history teaches us that wars driven by endurance often end not with triumph, but with exhaustion and miscalculation. Because every strategy that depends on patience assumes the other side will blink first. And every escalation designed to intimidate carries the risk of unintended consequences. As international observers increasingly warn, the margin for error is narrowing. The Kremlin's calculus is not static. It is evolving, shaped by battlefield realities, alliance politics, domestic pressures, and global attention. Each move now carries amplified consequences, and as this war enters its next chapter, one truth becomes unavoidable. The most dangerous moment is not when armies clash. It is when leaders believe time is on their side. If the Kremlin believes time is its greatest weapon, then NATO's response has quietly revolved around one central question: how do you deny an adversary the advantage of waiting? Publicly, the alliance speaks in familiar language: unity, deterrence, defensive posture. But behind closed doors, according to verified international reporting from outlets such as Reuters, Politico, and the Financial Times, NATO's internal conversations have shifted dramatically. This is no longer about reacting to Russian moves. It is about reshaping the timeline of the war itself. Because NATO understands something crucial: Putin's calculus only works if the West remains predictable. For much of the conflict, Russia could anticipate the rhythm of Western decision-making, debates in parliaments, budget cycles, election seasons, coalition negotiations. Each delay reinforced Moscow's belief that endurance would eventually fracture unity. But recent months suggest a strategic correction is underway. Instead of short-term aid packages, NATO states are moving toward structural commitment. Defense production lines across Europe are being retooled for sustained output, not emergency replenishment. According to a verified European defense industry report, artillery shell production has increased multiple times over pre-war levels, with contracts extending years into the future. This is not crisis response. This is long war planning, and that sends a message Moscow cannot ignore. At the same time, NATO has deliberately blurred the line between support and integration. Ukrainian forces are now trained on alliance standard systems, operate with real-time intelligence fusion, and coordinate logistics through multinational frameworks. While Ukraine remains formally outside NATO, its military is increasingly interoperable with it. This is strategic ambiguity by design. Because for Moscow, the fear is not NATO tanks crossing borders. It is NATO becoming inseparable from Ukraine's warfighting capacity. A scenario where escalation risks triggering alliance-level consequences even without formal membership. Yet NATO's challenge is not only external, it is internal. Alliance leaders must manage public fatigue, economic pressure, and political divisions, especially as elections approach in key capitals. According to international polling data cited by major news organizations, support for Ukraine remains strong but uneven. Governments understand that unity cannot rely on emotion alone. It must be anchored in clear strategic outcomes. That is why the language has changed. Officials increasingly describe the war not as charity or solidarity, but as investment in European security architecture. Ukraine is framed as a forward defense line, not a distant conflict, but a determinant of NATO's future credibility. And credibility, for an alliance built on deterrence, is existential. This is where NATO's shadow war begins. While public attention remains fixed on missile strikes and ground advances, less visible domains have become critical battlegrounds. Cyber operations, intelligence disruption, sanctions enforcement, and counter-disinformation campaigns now operate continuously, quietly shaping the conflict's trajectory. According to verified cybersecurity assessments, Russian-linked cyber activity has surged. But so have defensive countermeasures. Energy grids, communications networks, and military logistics systems across Europe are now treated as part of the same security ecosystem. An attack on one is increasingly viewed as pressure on all. This collective framing is intentional, because Putin's calculus depends on isolating responses, turning each escalation into a bilateral crisis rather than an alliance-wide concern. NATO's strategy, by contrast, is to collapse distinctions between theaters, domains, and timelines. But this strategy carries its own risks. By embedding Ukraine deeper into NATO's operational logic, the alliance raises the stakes of every Russian decision. Escalation becomes more dangerous not because NATO seeks confrontation, but because misinterpretation becomes easier. And history is unforgiving when great powers misread one another. Meanwhile, inside Russia, this evolving NATO posture is portrayed as proof of long-held narratives. State media frames expanded Western support as confirmation that Russia is fighting not Ukraine, but an encircling coalition. This reinforces domestic support while narrowing diplomatic off-ramps. According to analysts quoted by international security forums, this feedback loop is one of the war's most dangerous dynamics. Each side's defensive measure is interpreted as offensive intent by the other. And yet, despite this tension, both sides are acting with notable restraint, avoiding actions that would trigger direct confrontation. This restraint is not weakness. It is calculation. NATO understands that its greatest advantage is not military superiority alone, but strategic patience without paralysis. The alliance seeks to outlast Moscow's assumptions, to demonstrate that Western political cycles do not equate to strategic exhaustion. And signs of that effort are emerging. Long-term security agreements, bilateral defense compacts, and multi-year funding frameworks signal a shift from emergency aid to institutionalized support. These arrangements are designed to survive elections, leadership changes, and public mood swings. In other words, NATO is attempting to neutralize time itself as a variable. But Putin is watching closely. Because if Russia concludes that the West has successfully locked in long-term commitment, the Kremlin's calculus may change dramatically. A strategy built on waiting collapses if waiting no longer weakens the opponent. And that is the inflection point now approaching. As one senior European official reportedly told a verified international outlet, the danger is not that Russia escalates suddenly. The danger is that Russia realizes it cannot afford not to. From the outside, the Kremlin projects control, stability, resolve. The image of a state unfazed by sanctions, resilient under pressure, and fully mobilized for a prolonged confrontation with the West. But beneath that surface, the story is more complex and far more fragile. Because every long war eventually turns inward. According to verified reporting from international financial and security outlets, Russia's ability to sustain this conflict rests not only on battlefield outcomes, but on an intricate balance between economic endurance, political legitimacy, and social control. And that balance is under growing strain. The Russian economy has not collapsed. That is true. Sanctions did not produce the immediate shock many expected. Instead, Moscow adapted, rerouting energy exports, expanding trade with non-Western partners, and shifting toward a wartime economic model. Defense production surged, state spending increased, employment in military-linked industries expanded, but adaptation is not the same as immunity. Independent economic analyses cited by reputable global institutions indicate that Russia's war economy is increasingly distorted. Resources are being pulled away from civilian sectors. Inflationary pressure remains persistent. Labor shortages have intensified as skilled workers are absorbed into defense industries or removed from the workforce altogether. This is the hidden cost of endurance. The Kremlin has attempted to manage these pressures through control rather than reform. Price caps, export restrictions, narrative discipline. The goal is not prosperity, it is predictability. A population that can absorb discomfort without demanding accountability. And so far, that strategy has worked. But cracks are visible. According to sociological data referenced by international observers, public support for the war remains broad but shallow. Many Russians accept the conflict as inevitable, even necessary, but enthusiasm is limited. The war is tolerated, not embraced. It is endured, not celebrated. This distinction matters, because wars sustained by tolerance require constant narrative reinforcement, and the Kremlin has invested heavily in that effort. State media frames the conflict as existential, a defense against Western domination, cultural erasure, and geopolitical humiliation. Victory is defined not by territory gained, but by survival achieved. Yet this framing has consequences. By casting the war as a struggle against an external enemy, the Kremlin narrows its room for compromise. Any settlement that appears to concede ground risks undermining the very narrative that sustains public compliance. Peace becomes dangerous, not because it ends the war, but because it raises questions. Questions about cost, about purpose, about outcome. This is why Putin's dismissal of NATO-backed peace initiatives carries such weight. It is not merely a rejection of Western terms, it is a refusal to reopen the story before the Kremlin decides how it ends. But internal pressures are not limited to economics or narrative control. The Russian military itself is under sustained stress. According to verified defense assessments, Russia has adapted tactically, improving drone usage, fortifications, and electronic warfare. But these adaptations come at a cost. Equipment losses remain significant. Personnel rotation strains readiness. Command structures are under constant pressure to deliver results without escalating beyond political constraints. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. Commanders are incentivized to demonstrate progress, sometimes at disproportionate cost. Strategic patience at the top can translate into operational risk at the front, and while the Kremlin manages dissent ruthlessly, it cannot fully suppress institutional friction within its own system. History offers sobering parallels. Long wars often erode cohesion not through rebellion, but through bureaucratic fatigue, competing priorities, risk aversion, quiet resistance, the slow accumulation of decisions made to avoid blame rather than achieve clarity. And yet, Putin remains firmly in control. This is not a regime on the verge of collapse. The security apparatus is intact. Opposition is fragmented. Elite cohesion, while strained, remains functional. The Kremlin's greatest strength lies in its ability to absorb pressure without visible fracture. But that strength also creates vulnerability, because systems built on control often struggle with adaptation when conditions change rapidly. They are excellent at managing known risks and poor at responding to unexpected shifts. And unexpected shifts are precisely what this war threatens to produce. Consider the international environment. According to verified diplomatic reporting, Russia's relationships with key non-Western partners are transactional, not unconditional. Energy buyers seek discounts. Arms partners weigh reputational cost. Strategic alignment does not equal strategic sacrifice. Moscow cannot assume unlimited external support. At the same time, Western sanctions enforcement has become more targeted, more coordinated, and more persistent. Loopholes are closing. Financial oversight is tightening. Long-term access to advanced technologies remains constrained. These pressures accumulate slowly, but relentlessly, which brings us back to Putin's calculus. Endurance is only an advantage if the system sustaining it remains stable. Time only works in your favor if nothing else breaks first. And here lies the Kremlin's dilemma. Escalating the war risks international consequences. De-escalating risks internal narrative collapse. Maintaining the status quo risks gradual erosion. There is no clean exit. This is why ambiguity has become Moscow's default posture. By keeping options open, by signaling strength without commitment, by threatening escalation without triggering it, the Kremlin buys time, even as time extracts its price. But history suggests that such balances rarely hold indefinitely. At some point, pressure demands decision. And then there is the question of escalation psychology. Putin's long-standing leadership style has been defined by risk tolerance calibrated through control. He escalates when he believes the opponent will absorb pressure. He pauses when resistance stiffens. This pattern has shaped Russia's actions in Georgia, Crimea, Syria, and now Ukraine. But Ukraine is different. Ukraine is not absorbing pressure quietly. It is adapting, innovating, and increasingly striking beyond the front lines. According to verified defense reporting, Ukrainian forces have expanded their operational reach, targeting logistics, command nodes, and symbolic assets that carry strategic and psychological weight. Each such strike forces Moscow to respond not always militarily, but narratively. Control must be reaffirmed, vulnerability must be denied, and escalation must be framed as defensive. This creates a narrowing corridor for restraint. At the same time, NATO faces its own dilemma. The alliance has successfully avoided direct confrontation while materially shaping the battlefield. But as Ukrainian capabilities grow, NATO's role becomes harder to separate from outcomes on the ground. Deterrence relies on clarity, yet clarity risks provocation. According to senior Western officials cited by verified outlets, the alliance is now managing two timelines simultaneously, supporting Ukraine's present needs while preparing for a future security environment that may look fundamentally different. That future is shaped not only by Russia's choices but by global perception, because the world is watching how this war unfolds. Countries outside the Euro-Atlantic sphere are drawing lessons about power, alliances, sanctions, and resilience. They are watching to see whether prolonged pressure can fracture coalitions, whether economic penalties deter aggression, whether international norms hold when tested over time. This war is not just about Ukraine, it is about precedent, and precedent shapes behavior. That is why the Kremlin is so invested in controlling the narrative of endurance. Even if territorial gains are limited, survival itself can be framed as victory, proof that Russia cannot be isolated, broken, or coerced. But endurance has limits. According to long-term conflict studies referenced by international academic institutions, wars sustained through centralized control often face their greatest test not at the peak of violence, but during periods of stagnation when costs accumulate without visible progress. This is where miscalculation becomes most likely, because frustration grows, patience thins, and leaders may seek decisive action to break deadlock even if risks increase. This does not mean escalation is inevitable, but it does mean that the margin for error is shrinking. A single incident, an attack misattributed, a civilian tragedy amplified, a misinterpreted movement could force choices no side wants to make, and once those choices are made, reversal becomes difficult. Yet despite all this, one fact remains clear: no side is acting blindly. Putin is not reckless. Zelensky is not impulsive. NATO is not complacent. Each actor is acutely aware of what is at stake, which is precisely why the situation is so precarious. Because rational actors operating under pressure can still produce irrational outcomes. History offers countless examples. Conflicts that began with limited aims and expanded beyond control. Crises where deterrence held until it didn't. Moments where leaders believed they could manage escalation only to discover too late that escalation manages itself. This is why analysts increasingly describe the current phase of the war as one of strategic suspense. Not waiting for peace, not waiting for victory, but waiting to see which assumption fails first. Will Russia's endurance strategy outlast Western unity? Will NATO's long-term commitment reshape the battlefield faster than Moscow anticipates? Will Ukraine maintain momentum under sustained pressure, or will an unforeseen shock redraw the entire equation? These questions do not have immediate answers, and perhaps that is the most honest conclusion. The Kremlin's calculus is not a single decision. It is a continuous process recalculated with every strike, every statement, every election, every shift in global attention. What makes this moment so consequential is not what has already happened, but what has not yet happened. The war's outcome will not be decided in one dramatic moment. It will be shaped by endurance, missteps, adaptations, and moments of restraint that never make headlines. And somewhere inside the Kremlin, inside NATO headquarters, inside Kiev's command centers, leaders are doing the same thing tonight. Calculating, recalculating, watching time pass. Because in modern war, the most powerful weapon is not firepower, it is the belief that time itself can be controlled. And history has never been kind to those who believed that for too long.